Welcome back, guys, and today's video is going to be about how to fight big fish on a fly rod. It's a tricky thing, it's an interesting skill, and we're going to get right into it and look at my views and my opinions, along with some of the things that I have learned from those who are considerably better qualified than I. Subduing a big fish like a big tarpon or a giant trevally or a sailfish or something like that on a big fly rod or a 12 weight, 14 weight is a skill all in itself. Especially when it comes to giant trevally fishing in flats areas, shallow water, and also tarpon. These skills are paramount, and if you can master some of these skills, you can bring those battles down in length massively, and that's a good thing because that means that the fish can go back stronger and fitter, and they're much more likely to survive, which is really, really important. A lot of people ask me if it's possible to catch fish of this size on a fly rod, and of course it is. You can subdue pretty much anything on a fly rod, especially if there are certain methods that you can employ. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk about is foregrips. Foregrips on fly rods is one of those things which is a little bit of a contested issue. I was certainly very much pro foregrips for a very, very long time. When I first started GT fishing, when I first started sail fishing on the fly, I really required a foregrip because in my mind, it was a good way of stretching out one's bicep so that you could fight a fish at a better angle for your bicep rather than actually using a contracted bicep, which over a period of time is going to become very, very tiring. What I didn't really take into consideration, and something I learned later when I was involved with Howard Croston at Hardy's and also looking at some of the rod testing that we were doing at the time, I asked him, I said, look, why aren't you putting foregrips on these rods? Because you know, I really like a foregrip. So what he told me was that the thing about foregrips is essentially you are shortening the butt section of the rod, which is the most powerful section in a rod blank. That's the bit you fight big fish with. So if you put a foregrip in a little bit further above the rod butt and you start pulling on the foregrip, what you're actually doing is making all of the rod below that completely and utterly useless. So you're not using any of that blank. It also applies pressure in the wrong place of a blank. So a blank is designed to bend from much lower down. And if you start applying pressure halfway up that butt section, essentially you're going to create more pressure than that circle is designed for, and it will buckle. I mean, it certainly works on some of the really, really thick glass fiber based rods, but on modern high modulus carbon fiber, I think this is a really bad idea. And what I learned, having smashed a few, I hasten to add, that by dropping the rod entirely and holding onto the butt section with the fighting butt into my hip, I could, again, keep my arms straight, but at the same time, I could then use, by leaning backwards, the full curvature of that rod blank. And that is the bit that you're going to use for fighting fish. So essentially, rods are in three major sections. You have the tip section, the mid section, and the butt section. The tip section is designed for casting. Depending on what kind of action of fly rod you like, then your tip will either be quick or slightly slower, but a slightly more gentle tip section can often be a nicer rod to fish with. The mid section, again, is more of a casting section, and then you move into the butt section, which is the main area that you are going to generate power with. So before we move on to a couple of other bits and pieces, what I'd like to talk about is hook penetration. We all know when we trout strike, the rod comes up and the tip bends, and that is enough to penetrate the mouth of a small trout. When you start talking about big saltwater species such as giant trevally, tarpon, which have a mouth like a bucket of concrete, billfish, which have a very, very hard area around the mouth except that soft palate which you've got to drive the hook home into, all of those species require far more penetrating power, and you're using fairly large hooks. It's a big piece of iron you're trying to drive into that. So the first thing when it comes to fighting big fish is the hook set. Now the hook set on saltwater is paramount. So what you've got to do is drop the rod angle, point the rod directly at the fish, and with the other hand you strip strike. So you are going to strip and punch that hook in a straight line, because the straight line between you and the hook, that is what is going to penetrate the area of the fish's mouth that you're trying to drive the hook home into. And that is what is going to give you your good hook hold. Once you've got your good hook hold, try saying that 10 times, good hook hold, good hook hold. No. Anyway, I digress. Once you've got your good hook hold, that's when you can start thinking about how you're going to battle these fish. Now I have to admit, when I first came to saltwater fishing, like everyone, I didn't really have a clue what I was doing. I was very lucky, and I met a number of people who have certainly influenced the way that I have taken to fighting big fish. The first was Andrew Parsons in Mozambique, who taught me to really hook and hold. I didn't know how much power it was possible to apply with a fly rod until I'd met him. We were catching a lot of trevally species, bludger trevally, queenfish and things like that in Mozambique, and Andrew was the first person that I'd ever seen who literally just hit the fish and just hung on. And I was like, how on earth can you possibly do that? But he proved to me very, very quickly that you can put an enormous amount of power into a fish, and the best way to do that is to actually lock down on it. It's not always possible, obviously, you know, some very, very big tarpon you can't lock down on, you can't hold it there, but some GTs you certainly can. And he taught me that you can apply an enormous amount of pressure with a fly rod. And then I think one of my mentors, certainly when it came to thinking about how to fight big fish, was Billy Pate. Although I never met him, as a child, I used to watch the series of international destination videos by Jim and Kelly Watt, which I don't know if anyone else has, but there was a particular video that Billy Pate is in talking about Florida Keys tarpon, and he talks about delivering the low blow in shallow water. Now I heard that and I didn't really understand what it was in my teenage years, but now I totally understand. So when he was in the shallow areas fighting these big tarpon, what he would do is he would start driving sideways and down with a fly rod. And as he pulled down, that would drop the fish's head into the flat. So if it's trying to swim away from you and you pulling its head down rather than up, it can fight you much, much easier going downwards. Whereas if you start pulling from below and you're actually pulling that fish's head down into the deck, it's got nowhere to go, and it immediately puts it off balance and makes it extremely uncomfortable. And you can do that with giant trevally, and you can do that with tarpon. And the other thing that he always did was fight from different angles. So if the fish is moving left, for example, you're going to start pulling it down and to the right. And as soon as that fish switches over and travels in the other direction, you're going to flip the rod right over, and that's when you start pulling down and away from it in the same angle. So you are constantly pushing that fish off balance. It can never have a chance to regain its breath, and that is exactly how you landed a big fish in a very short space of time. So by not allowing it to take as much line as it wants, by hooking and holding, and by using these methods of really down and dirty tactics on fish, you can apply maximum pressure. Now the third person who I learned an enormous amount from was Andy Mill. Now Andy Mill is a 5 times Gold Cup Tarpon Championship winner. He's also one of the developers of the Hardy Centrix range of rods, and there is very little that Andy does not know about landing big tarpon. And what Andy did, which I don't think I've seen anyone else do, is he made pulling on objects and pulling on fish into a science. So rather than just thinking about it, he would actually measure out the amount of pressure that he could apply with a fly rod, and he would practice it multiple times. And so for that, I don't think anybody can explain that better than Andy himself. So we're going to quickly flip over to a quick clip of how Andy does that.
Hello everybody, today we are off the mainland of Venezuela in the beautiful island of Las Rocas. And you might be wondering, what am I doing with a fly rod and a bucket of sand? I'm Andy Mill, and over the last 30 years I've been trying to focus on catching big tarpon effectively, efficiently. And today I'm going to teach you how to take a casting tool, which this fly rod is, and turn it into a fish fighting weapon. I'm going to take this pulley and attach it to the underside of a table. Take the butt section of my fly line, run it through this pulley, and attach it to this bucket. Now, when I stand back and try to pick this bucket up off the sand, if I do it efficiently and perfectly well with the right part of the fly rod, this bucket's going to come up off the sand. If I don't do it perfectly, I'm not even going to be able to move this bucket. Now remember, your fly rod has got three basic sections. Your tip bends for short distance casting, the midsection when you want to bust out a longer cast, and the butt of this rod is for fighting fish. Watch how, when I think I'm pulling hard and doubling that rod, that 12 pounds of sand does not move. And I can lean back, and you see people pulling like this, and they get the rod bent, and they think that they're kicking some ass, but no, nothing. All you're doing is bending a rod. Now, that's 12 pounds of sand. I can lift that with a pretty decent bend in my rod. You'll see here, okay? But look at my arms. I can't hold it for very long because I am not physically strong enough to hold 12 pounds of resistance. So the most important thing when you're fighting big fish is use the butt section of the rod. You straighten your rod, you straighten your arms, because now I'm anatomically stronger with my bones in a line and my muscles in a line. And now when I bend the rod here, I've got a lot of resistance on that fish, and watch, I can lift with my legs. And now you can see how easy that is. I can almost lift that with one hand. You see that? That's basically because I'm using this part of the rod. So remember, if you think you're fighting fish with a big bent rod like this, there's no resistance on that fish. Remember, the tip is for casting, the midsection is for casting, and the butt of the rod, and using the strength of your legs, that's where you fight big fish. You pull here, arms fairly straight, have the butt up against your body here for leverage, and you lift with your legs.
So by using these tips and tricks, which have been developed by people who have spent an awful lot of time doing it, like Billy Pate and Andy Mill, I certainly use a method of fighting fish which lands fish very, very quickly. I do not allow them to have very much line, especially with giant trevally, because that means that you can keep them close and away from the coral and the obstacles. I will fight a fish as hard as I physically can. It's kind of important to be in reasonable physical shape to be able to do this, and you can end that battle in a very, very short space of time. So what I tend to do is I hook that fish, I hit it very, very hard, and then I immediately begin to use my legs and my lower body to start applying pressure to the fish. So I will be constantly pumping and winding while moving it in different directions. So if that fish is traveling off to the left, as we covered before, I am going to start pumping to the right, and I pump and I use my legs and I use my back, and I pump and I wind. So I pump, put 2 or 3 winds on the reel, pump again, 2 or 3 turns on the reel, and a large arbor reel in this situation can be very beneficial. And by doing that and keeping a fish constantly off balance, one can land a fish in a very short space of time. Another really important thing to note is that, which Andy covered earlier, is that you can't really do much with the tip of a fly rod. You think you're bending a fly rod into a fish and you're giving it an enormous amount of grief. You're really not. It's by leaning backwards and putting the butt into your hip and using a full curvature of the rod blank. That is when you are applying maximum pressure. And actually, this is a method which is not only used by saltwater fishermen, by salmon fishermen as well. If you are hooked into a big salmon with a 2-handed salmon rod, you can employ exactly the same tactics. So rather than just having that big rod bending in the tip section, if you drop it right down, and you have a straighter line between you and the fish, you have much less give and much less stress, and you can apply so much more pressure. And you should go and try this for yourself. Put up a spring balance, use a pulley like Andy does, and you'll very quickly realize that you get used to the amount of pressure that you can apply. Most fly line cores break at 30 pounds. If you're using class tippet, you're using 16 or 20 pounds, or whatever class tippet you're using. Obviously with giant trevally, we're using normally 100, 130 for abrasion resistance, so the fly line is going to give more before that, so we use 50 pound cores. To break a 50 pound fly line core while pulling on it is very, very difficult. That is why it's absolutely key to make sure that all of your connections, your knots, your braided loops are as strong as can be possibly made, because that is the weakness. Those are the weak links in your line between you and your fish. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed these and will employ these useful tips and tricks. And if you did, then please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I will see you on our next episode.